Political columnist George Skelton has seen a lot since he started covering state politics in 1974. From Ronald Reagan being governor, to the passage of Prop 13 in 1978 that limited property taxes, to Prop 98 in 1988 that continues to mandate a minimum level of school funding, to Prop 184 in 1994 that established California's toughest in the nation three strikes law, to the return of Jerry Brown as governor in 2011, 36 years after he was first elected governor in 1975. We'll look back at state politics and discuss how state government has changed with the dean of the Capitol Press Corps, LA Times columnist George Skelton. California Retrospective, a conversation with George Skelton of the LA Times.
From Fresno, the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. The Sacramento Press Club noted that our guest, George Skelton, quote, has had an exemplary career tracking and influencing California's political history from Pat Brown in the 1950s to Jerry Brown a half-century later, and his readers are the richer for it. We are delighted to have LA Times columnist George Skelton as our guest and give us his perspective on California politics and how it's evolved over the last several decades. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you.
Well, let's begin with a discussion of governors. Pat Brown, he was governor from 1959 to 1967. Did a lot of big things, the State Water Project, transportation projects, etc. His tenure was fairly successful, people think. A lot of big ideas. Why was he so successful, and can that happen again?
Two reasons why he was successful. One was the state was rolling in money at the time. This was only about 15 years after World War II. State was booming. A lot of tax revenue rolling in, and the question was not how do we raise money to build freeways, build campuses of the University of California, but where do we put them? The big fights were over where do we put the freeway, where do we put the campus, does the State Water Project really make sense, and does Northern California want to give up its water to Southern California and the farmers down in the valley? So those are the big political questions, not the money, not like today. That having said that, Pat Brown was a real leader, and could it happen again today? Of course. I mean, we just have different problems to solve today. Pat Brown was the kind of guy who could get in and bring people together and work out compromises. And anybody seen the movie Lincoln, they know how all that works. I mean, in Pat Brown's case, he gave away savings and loans charters, judgeships, and whatever it took to get that water project built. And sure, it could happen again.
Well, let's talk about another governor. You covered actually as president, Ronald Reagan. He was obviously the governor of California as well. How was he as governor?
He was a good governor. I wouldn't call him a great governor, but he was. He knew what he didn't know, and so he would seek to find out what he didn't know, and he had a talent of appointing good people around him, surrounding himself with staff who were not only politically smart, but also were public policy wonks and made the right decisions, and he listened to them.
So we also had Pete Wilson and George Duke-Majan. What's their legacy?
Boring, but they were effective in their own way. They were George Duke-Majan built prisons. Yeah, that's what his legacy is. He also was the first governor in the nation to sign an assault weapons ban, although he was a conservative Republican. So that kind of thing is his legacy is integrity, honesty, strong-willed. Pete Wilson was a feisty ex-Marine who loved to fight. Took on lots of fights, and he also came into office with all kinds of problems. He had the biggest budget deficit of anyone ever. It's still a record, and he immediately raised taxes, even though he was a Republican, and got in all kinds of problems with his party with that. But he did that nevertheless. Of course, his legacy will be Proposition 187. Which sought to deny services to illegal immigrants, and it was thrown out by the Supreme Court. But it turned off Latino voters and set back the Republican Party for at least a generation.
Let's talk about Gray Davis and Arnold Schwarzenegger. What was their legacy?
Well, Gray Davis was a sad case because he could have been an effective governor. sold out to the labor unions basically in that first year, but that's not what cost him his recall. It was the Enron power pirates from Texas who gamed the California energy system and made Gray Davis look very bad, and I believe that's what cost him the recall. Schwarzenegger was just a big disappointment. Everybody was expecting more from him. Why, I don't know. He didn't know anything about government, knew little about American democracy despite his marriage to a Kennedy. And he got up here and thought he knew it all, and it took a while for him finally to get on to what he's supposed to do, and he finally turned out to be okay towards the end.
Let me ask you the last question about Jerry Brown. Can you compare him, his first time in office to now?
Well, the first time in office, he wasn't a very good governor. He let all the things that Pat Brown built kind of start to crumble. He wasn't big on highways, infrastructure, higher education. He had a short attention span. It just wasn't very good. We don't know about the second. So far, so good with Jerry. He learned a lot the first time. He knows what he can do, what he can't do. He seems to be getting this budget under control. And we'll just have to wait and see, but at the very minimum, he's a better governor now than he was before.
Okay, great. Well, up next, we're going to talk about the California legislature. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with the Dean of the Capitol Press Corps, George Skelton of the LA Times. In the 1970s, it was described as California's golden age in terms of the legislative process. It's been a long time, however, since the California legislature has been held in such high regard. So the question is, what happened? Jesse Unruh was the California Speaker of the Assembly from 1961 to 69, and he helped pass Prop 1A in 1966 that created the full-time legislature. So the question is, has the full-time legislature done a better job than the part-time legislature that it followed?
Well, the answer is no, it hasn't, but it's got nothing to do whether it's full-time or part-time. The current legislature hasn't done as good as the part-time legislature because of term limits and many other factors that we can get into later if you'd like to. But the part-time legislature did do a good job. It had, because of its composition, it had several guys who had fought in World War II, and they were up here, and I can remember PT boat captains and infantrymen, and these guys were not afraid of the NRA or the insurance lobby or the anti-tax lobby or any of them. I mean, they basically had strong will, and they did what they thought was right. I'm not saying there wasn't some corruption in there, but they weren't cowed by anybody. So these were, and also at the time, this was a very pro-government time. Jack Kennedy had just got elected. People were excited about government. Pat Brown was on a tear, leading, and legislators were going right along with it, and they were getting things done. It had nothing.
Pre-Watergate days.
Pre-Watergate, pre-Vietnam,
yeah.
Right.
Let me ask about Willie Brown, who referred to himself as the Ayatollah of the Assembly. He was the Assembly Speaker from 1980 to 1995, and one of the key arguments for term limits was his tenure. In retrospect, how would you evaluate Willie Brown as Speaker?
Well, he's often described as brilliant, and I would give him that. He was brilliant about keeping himself in power and the Democrats in power. He wasn't much of a policy wonk. Wasn't really big on public policy, but he had some good committee chairmen who were. Willie called himself the poster boy for term limits, and I quite frankly think that's because of racism. People weren't ready for a black political leader who wore fancy clothes and drove fast cars and was a admitted womanizer and who had afro haircuts or whatever the latest dude thing was. And there's a lot of racism involved that there wasn't involved with guys like Tom Bradley, who was mayor of LA. So I think that was his biggest problem.
What about term limits? What has it done to the legislature's performance? Has it gotten better or worse with term limits?
Well, I think term limits are a disaster. I mean, I think the best term limits are at the ballot box. If you don't like the job somebody's doing, you vote them out of office. I mean, that's the problem with term limits is that it threw out very good people along with not so good people like Ken Maddy. Yeah, Ken Maddy. I mean, he should have been here until he died, quite frankly. He was a very effective legislator, got along with everybody. Public policy first, wanted to make sure government did things. And you mentioned Jess Under, I'll tell you a story about that. Jess once told me that if he had Ken Maddy's looks, he'd be president by now. I think this was in the early 70s or something.
You know, they recently changed the term limits law, and they're allowing legislators now to stand for 12 years in one office. Is that going to help in terms of term limits, longer period of time?
Well, we'll see. I mean, I think it will. I mean, people will be able to keep their committee chairmanships longer and develop some power and expertise there, have a greater ability to get things done. And I'm hoping it works. We don't know yet.
What about the importance of relationships to the legislative process? A lot of people say, you know, Ken Maddy was very good at that. Is that important?
It's overrated, but it is important for people to know each other, trust each other, and to not wish each other ill, which I think Republicans in Congress right now do or have to President Obama. They just don't want him to succeed because they don't like him. If you like somebody, you might not give them everything they want, but you're not going to do what you do just to make them fail. I mean,
I suppose Republicans would say that about President Bush, I guess. But let me ask you one last question.
I think that's true also.
In this segment, and that is the oversight responsibility of the legislature to the executive branch to make sure that the laws they pass are actually being followed. Has oversight gotten better or worse over time?
Oversight is a casualty of term limits because people are on committees for maybe 1 year, 2 at the most. They're chairman of one committee for 2 years and another committee for 2 years. They don't have a vested interest in how that policy works out, whether what they pass actually is carried out the way they wanted it to be. They're going to be gone in 5 years, so what do they care? I mean, this is what's happened to oversight. There is none, in other words.
Okay. When we come back, we'll talk about what's been spawned by voter discontent with the legislative process, the initiative process, and the unintended consequences as a result. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with George Skelton, political columnist for the Los Angeles Times. The Economist magazine once described the political process in California as, quote, an experiment in extreme democracy gone wrong, unquote. They specifically focused on the California initiative and proposition process that's redistributed power away from the legislature and given it to the people directly. So there seems to be an extraordinary use of propositions in California. What impact has that had on the legislative process?
Well, every time an initiative is passed, that's one less thing the legislature can do. It ties their hands, whether it's requiring that money be spent a certain way or a certain policy be carried out. That just means the legislature can't touch it unless they go back to the people. So it makes the legislature less flexible, and it's one of the things that contributes to so-called dysfunctional legislating.
You know, citizens believe that they make better public policy decisions than the elected representatives that they have, but those same polls show that California voters are generally fairly ignorant about the basic facts of state government. Are we just getting the government we deserve?
Well, I don't think they deserve it. I think they deserve better government, but they're getting the government they ask for.
So is it, if the legislators were more effective, maybe we wouldn't see so many initiatives?
Well, actually, I think that's a myth. I think that for the most part, there's exceptions, but a lot of times what happens is the legislature refuses to do what the special interests want them to do. So the special interests then, they have a lot of money, they go out and they sponsor an initiative, and they hire political consultants to con the voters into voting their way, and they say the legislature wouldn't do it, so we're going to do it. But
is Hiram Johnson rolling in his grave?
Yeah, well, Hiram, you know, we're talking 100 years later, and a lot of things have changed since Hiram Johnson was around here riding buggies.
Well, let's talk about some of the propositions, some of the initiatives. Prop 13, big one in 1978. It limited property tax increases and also created this 2/3 requirement for passing most taxes. How did it alter the balance of power?
Well, at least a couple of ways. What it did was take money away from local governments, the property tax, and local governments didn't have the property tax to fund schools, courts, whatever. So they came up to Sacramento, begged for money. Sacramento gave them $5–6 billion back in 1978, and Sacramento's owned local government and schools ever since. Sacramento gives local government and schools the money, and they dictate how that money is spent.
He who has the money makes the rules.
That's right. So loss of local control, that's one thing. The 2/3 vote requirement for tax increases just tied the hands of the legislature. Before that, in the great old days before Prop 13, the legislature could pass a tax increase on a majority vote, and did routinely. Passed it one year, lowered it the next year, depending on the circumstances. Haven't been able to do that since then. So that's why another reason the legislature's looked at as dysfunctional, because they can't collect 2/3 vote for something without giving the store away.
Let's talk about Prop 98 in 1988, and that created significant restraints on the legislature by saying, you know, about 40% of the state budget has to go to education. What are the consequences of such attempts at ballot box budgeting?
Well, it just means that 40% of the budget, at least, is out of the legislature's hands, basically, and it's already dictated to. Like, I mean, in the last few years, when they've had these great deficits, schools have been cut less than anything else. Poor people cut terribly. Higher education's cut. Tuition's risen because they haven't been able to spread the money around like they'd like to, just because of 98.
So end on this note, new election reforms, you know, open primaries, those kinds of things. Is that going to make California more governable?
Well, we're going to have to wait and see about the open primary. I'm hopeful. I sure wanted it to pass, and I have great hope for it.
So I guess we're going to see on
and
that.
And redistricting, honest redistricting, no gerrymandering. I think this is going to make, I think it's going to moderate the legislature and make it more pragmatic.
Okay, great. Well, up next, we'll talk about some reforms that make California government more responsive and effective. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with George Skelton, political columnist for the Los Angeles Times. You know, some think that the political process is out of sync with the needs and desires of most Californians, and they think maybe that there needs to be legislative reforms, things like a part-time legislature or a unicameral legislature, or increase the number, or remove term limits, whatever. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm definitely against a part-time legislature. I think that if you make these guys part-time, you put them on part-time pay, where are they going to get the money for the rest of the year? I mean, I'll tell you where they're going to get it. They can get it for special interests. I mean, the great concept, go back to the community and work there for a while, but who's going to hire him there for 3 months, 4 months, 6 months? It's going to be something involving special interest, and I think it's going to would make it more corrupt.
What about increasing the number of legislators? I'm not sure there's the public will for that.
I mean, I hate to sound like Rush Limbaugh, but we already have enough politicians in Sacramento. We don't need more. And the problem is we probably have too many right now to make decisions. If anything, we could use fewer.
Okay. Well, usually the state budget is Exhibit A when people talk about the dysfunctional nature of state politics. How can the budget process be improved?
Well, you know, it is improving. It used to be dysfunctional when it required a 2/3 vote to pass a budget, but 3 years ago, voters in their wisdom decided to make it a majority vote for a budget, and we've had on-time budgets the last 2 years. So it's not a huge problem anymore.
What about the Big Five? Should that process be changed? The Big Five is where you have the governor and the 4 legislative leaders get together to solve things like the budget.
I don't like the Big Five. I mean, I think I like to go back to the way it used to be, where each house would pass a budget, and then it would go to a conference committee and then negotiate there. The governor would have his representative in there and have his input, but he wouldn't be sitting down there negotiating with just 4 legislators. I don't like that. I think all legislators should have some skin in the game, and I think the budget committee chairman ought to have a lot of power over the budget, and not just who happens to be the leaders. In fact, the Big Five is going to fall apart anyway because Republicans no longer have any leverage. It's going to be the Big Three. It'll be the governor and the 2 Democratic leaders, no longer the 2 Republican leaders.
What about supermajority rules? Some say that they grant tremendous power to a few at the expense of majority rule. Others say it's a necessary check on majority overreach. What do you think?
I think minority rule is anti-democracy, undemocratic. I mean, I think that in a democracy, the majority should rule, except in very few exceptions, like in Congress to approve treaties, constitutional amendments. I mean, they should be 2/3. Bonds, maybe the legislature should pass bonds on a 2/3, but everything else, taxes particularly, should be a majority vote, and let the majority party be accountable and be responsible. Do something, and the voters don't like it, kick them out.
Okay, let's talk about the initiative process again just for a second. Some reforms. Should there be a higher bar to come forward with an initiative? What changes do you think need to be made there?
Well, there's been a proposal to have a direct initiative, which California actually used to have and it wasn't used, so they scrapped it. But a direct initiative would be, or I forget, maybe it's indirect, I don't know what the hell it is, but I'll explain it. People go out and collect signatures for an initiative that qualifies for the ballot. Then you go to the legislature and say, hey, you want to weigh in on this? If you want to improve it, change it, and if it's okay with us, fine. We'll do it without putting it on the ballot. You guys do it, and we won't put it on the ballot. We'll save a lot of money. I like that idea. Let the legislature blend in with the initiative sponsors and see if they can't work out a good compromise. That way it's vetted, it's constitutional, just better piece of legislation.
Okay, one last question, and that is, California's changing, obviously, tremendously in terms of its ethnic composition. What impact do you think that's going to have on state politics?
Well, definitely the minorities are going to be in the majority and are going to be electing the majority of the legislators in the next 2 or 3 generations, probably. Remains to be seen what effect that's going to have, but we might be able to get some gun control in those days, huh? Maybe the white guys are no longer in charge of the legislature.
What about the impact on, say, the Republican Party? Is that going to make them, are they going to be able to get back in the game?
Well, the only way they can get back into the game is to appeal to Latinos. And
so get past the Prop 187 situation.
That's right, or else they'll become a party of the past, history in this state, no question about it.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank George Skelton from the Los Angeles Times for being our guest today. If you want to keep up with state and local politics, you can sign up for our award-winning e-newsletter, The Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the Maddy Institute, the California Channel, Casey, or Valley PBS. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions shared in the Maddy Report, visit our website at valleypbs.org/Maddy. This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.